The sound of it reverberated throughout the entire monarchy, even though it happened in quiet. The Crown Foundation carried the legacy of many generations in one instant. The next, under Catherine's authority, even its name had been altered. The declaration was made by the king himself, not by courtiers or aides. His shaky voice suggested something more profound, such as a ceding of authority or the start of a covert coup. It was a succinct, almost purposefully obscure remark. However, in just a few well-chosen words, the entire weight of the monarchy appeared to move over television screens and newsrooms, and anchors found it difficult to remain calm as the news spread around the country. Charles stated that the Crown Foundation will now proceed under new direction, reflecting the future that the Princess of Wales has inspired. Nobody overlooked the wording, not with her backing, but under her authority. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update before we delve deeper into what this actually means for the royal family. Headlines spread like wildfire in a matter of minutes. Catherine is given authority by Charles. Windsor had a silent revolution. The crown is rewritten by the future queen. Once the unwavering emblem of royal tradition, the very institution now seemed to yield almost voluntarily to the power of a single woman, whose cool precision concealed a quiet tempest. That day, Catherine herself was nowhere to be found. Courtiers whispered and cameras flashed, but her absence spoke louder than any words. The king was able to convey the message while she remained untouchable, calm, strategic, and invisible, as though she had planned the maneuver from the shadows. Confusion blended with wonder inside the palace. The action was not voluntary, senior aides muttered. Others recounted a week of private conflict, meetings held behind closed doors, and documents shuttled between offices in sealed envelopes. The foundation, which the king had previously personally supervised, was now essentially under it. Many questioned whether Charles had really grasped what he had just signed away because of Catherine's management, a change that was both subtle and irrevocable. Even though he spoke steadily in public, there was a noticeable quiver in his voice, the kind that appears when power starts to shift. For a long time, the foundation was more than just a charity. It was the monarchy's moral compass masquerading as kindness, influence, legacy, and image. Through it, royal power was used behind charitable smiles, reputations were enhanced, and crises were eased. For Charles to abandon its power was not a symbolic act. It was a subtle surrender of one of his most powerful tools. And in her silence, Catherine had turned into the mastermind behind that change. She hadn't asked for it. She had won it with strategic placement, measured grace, and the kind of contemporary appeal that the monarchy could no longer overlook. From the hallways of Windsor, rumors poured in. Advisors had urged against the move, calling it premature and politically sensitive. Others asserted that Catherine's team had given the king a dossier, a vision for the foundation's continued relevance, written in her own hand and replete with words of moral regeneration, unification, and change. It sounded noble to the general populace. It sounded like a warning to the palace. Resistance would be pointless as Catherine's era began to emerge. One phrase, the reversal, started to circulate among courtiers in whispers. It explained a fundamental restructuring of the internal order of the monarchy, which many felt was taking place behind closed doors. All royal influence had revolved around the current monarch for generations. However, insiders whispered that the axis had changed. A power greater than procedure seemed to be directing, if not dictating, the king's actions. Catherine's ideas about the future of the crown. She was now referred to as the guiding hand, almost reverently, by those who had previously referred to her as the future queen. Questions continued to hover in the atmosphere, like a storm that would not go away. Charles had acted now, but why? What had caused such a strong, nearly frantic shift? Some claimed that the king's physical and mental exhaustion was due to health, and he perceived Catherine as a source of salvation rather than a threat. Others said he was cornered, that he had no choice but to give in due to her increasing popularity, her impeccable public persona, and her subtle influence. But since this was more than just an announcement, the reality was concealed beneath layers of fear and loyalty, deeper than conjecture. Behind the polished facade of royal unity, something enormous was taking place. It was the visible tremor that precedes an invisible earthquake. For many who were paying careful attention, it appeared to be the beginning of a change that would redefine the monarchy as a whole, as well as the foundation of the crown. But we must go back to where it all started in order to comprehend this extraordinary moment. A single document transformed everything inside the palace walls. Before Catherine's advisors discovered it, a centuries-old document was hidden behind locked walls in Clarence House. Buried deep in the original charter of the Essex Foundation was a sentence so obscure that even royal attorneys had missed it. The right of reappointment to the monarch's successor in preparation was minor and nearly unnoticeable to the untrained eye. But its significance was profound. Everything was altered by that finding. It was more than just a formality to Catherine. It was the secret of reconfiguring royal power without ever going to war. The words were written in an era when queens still ruled with velvet tongues and iron will. And the parchment was ancient with faded ink. The file was traced back to Queen Victoria, whose special legacy protocol was created to ensure the continuation of the monarchy in the event that a reigning sovereign failed. But in more than a century, nobody has used it. Beneath layers of bureaucracy, its existence had become legendary, a historical curiosity. But recently, one advisor discovered it while Catherine's legal team examined funding systems for modernization. The clause provided a way to transfer the Crown Foundation's administrative and moral responsibility to the selected heir. Before succession, to put it another way, Catherine could legally, discreetly, and permanently assume leadership. Initially, only a circle of 5 people discussed the discovery. It was dubbed the Renniwell Initiative. It sounded innocuous, like a scheme for modernization. However, the atmosphere in those private encounters was anything but friendly. Cross-checked documents were used. We looked for precedents. It was the most potent sentence ever disregarded in royal law. According to Catherine's advisor, who was renowned for his accuracy and moderation, when applied properly, they immediately understood the consequences. Without ever going against tradition, this clause could realign authority within the monarchy. Catherine thought more quickly than anyone could have predicted. Instead of seeing a flaw in the charter, she saw a prophecy and a way to ensure her legacy long before she was formally crowned. However, ambition was not the only factor in her reasoning. She observed deterioration inside the organization and a gap between the monarchy and the populace it purported to represent. She saw modernization as redemption rather than insurrection. She would still need to be cautious in order to accomplish it. Everything could fall apart before it started with a single error or leak. Prince William's response to the finding was cautious, bordering on fear. Although he appreciated Catherine's vision, he cautioned her that timing was crucial. He warned, "I intervened too early, and they'll see it as a coup." Catherine paid attention, but she refused to back down. The true risk, in her opinion, was hesitation. "If we wait," she replied, "we'll be forced to defend artifacts rather than reconstruct the crown." Her determination solidified at that moment. Instead of acting as a submissive consort, she would design a monarchy that would endure controversy, conflict, and deterioration. A careful dance of patience and persuasion ensued. Instead of presenting her results to Charles as a challenge, Catherine positioned herself as the devoted reformer who was only interested in preserving his legacy. Charles, though, was suspicious. He saw the charter as a reminder of a monarchy that used to be governed by decree rather than consent. He was afraid of the power it gave to those who knew how to use it, not the clause itself. For weeks, maybe months, he fought, silently hoping the situation would go away. However, it didn't. As they persisted, Catherine's team softened the idea and presented it as continuity rather than change. Then, as it appeared that Charles's resistance had become firmly established, something changed. At first light, a letter with an unexpected seal, one that hadn't been used since the latter Queen's last years, arrived at Clarence House. Charles's tone abruptly altered after reading it. Whatever the words were, they were powerful enough to overcome his reluctance and replace it with a nervous acceptance. He called a private meeting with Catherine the following day. What was spoken inside those doors is unknown, but he didn't look defeated when he came out. Reluctantly, it was acknowledged. He was aware that Catherine was the one with the pen, and that history had already turned a new page. And that letter, which was discreetly sent at daybreak, had words that would permanently undermine a father's confidence as well as a seal that nobody anticipated. Charles wasn't hurt by the words per se. It was the author of them. Senior trustees who supported Catherine questioned his suitability to lead the monarchy's finance department in the letter. It was a stab to the heart for a guy whose legacy defined him. Beneath that suffering, however, was a well-timed scheme to move the monarchy's focus in Catherine's direction. The letter, which came in a plain envelope and was delivered silently, exploded in the palace like a bomb. It had a calm, almost courteous tone. However, each line sliced more deeply than the previous one. It stated that in order to maintain faith and honesty in the face of contemporary expectations, the foundation needs new stewardship. It didn't outright accuse him, but it didn't have to. It was obvious what was implied. His moral leadership had come to an end. Charles had spent decades trying to change the monarchy's perception to one of humanity, sustainability, and purpose. However, the Crown Foundation, his greatest invention, was now being used against him. The language of Catherine's vision was now spoken by those he had previously trusted. Modernism, reform, and rebirth. It sounded like progress to the general populace. He saw it as treachery disguised as diplomacy. The letter suggested giving the future Queen's team responsibility for the charity. The wording was purposeful and careful from a legal standpoint but devastating on an emotional level. By reaching an agreement rather than engaging in conflict, Catherine's allies had taken action. They portrayed him as the threat to the survival of the monarchy, and her as the answer to his declining credibility. The accuracy of the reasoning was severe. Under Charles's direction, the trustees pointed to a decline in confidence in charitable transparency, mentioning rumors of scandals that the palace had put a lot of effort into covering up. Advisors were concerned that decades of meticulous image rehabilitation may be destroyed by another pay-for-honors incident. They claimed that Catherine's leadership was the only way to stop the decline in public trust. It was a story meant to both corner and hurt him. He would come across as antiquated and defensive if he protested. He would be complicit in his own degradation if he consented. The ultimate trap had been constructed by Catherine's crew. Reactions within the palace were conflicting. For the king's humiliation, some aides shed tears. Some, younger and more astute, quietly acknowledged that the logic of the letter was indisputable. Catherine had become a reflection of the world that had altered. With compassion mixed with authority and diplomacy combined with accuracy, she articulated the language of a new era. She was seen by many as the human equivalent of the monarchy's redemption. She represented everything that suddenly made Charles feel outdated, unimportant and outrun. He became enraged right away. His aides regarded his retreat into quiet as volcanic, and he cancelled all public appearances for the week. He hardly said anything when Camilla tried to comfort him. The weight of unsaid words, disappointment, dread, and the overwhelming realization that power was slipping away from him reverberated throughout Clarence's home. However, there was something much more agonizing hidden underneath outrage. Admiration. He was aware that Catherine's hand was behind it, and he admired the accuracy with which she had carried out the blow. She hadn't yelled, insisted, or disobeyed. She had just let timing and truth take care of the rest. 3 nights later, the confrontation was unavoidable. Even though Catherine already knew why, she was called. For hours, they conversed behind closed doors as two forces caught in the same storm rather than as monarchs and subordinates. They both thought they were preserving the monarchy. Those who overheard parts described the talk as being quiet at first, then intense. Charles insisted on allegiance. Catherine made a legacy offer. She responded purposefully when he accused her of being ambitious. "This isn't rebellion," she stated calmly. "It's restoration. You built the house. I'm making sure it doesn't fall." Charles's attitude had changed after that encounter. Not to one of defeat, but to one of recognition that she now held the key to the monarchy's destiny. No crown, no ritual, no proclamation. However, everyone in the palace was aware that Catherine's reign had begun. It had been more than just a gesture to rename the Crown Foundation. It was a declaration, a subdued revolution taking place beneath the marble and gold of imperial custom. She was now the focal point through which all decisions were made without speeches or decrees. The monarchy had changed hands in spirit, power, and leadership, but not in name. It had already moved. Even while Charles was still king, everyone could sense that the balance of power had shifted from seasoned courtiers to private secretaries. The Crown Foundation was quickly, strategically, and painstakingly renovated by Catherine. She demolished decades-old hierarchies and rebuilt them in her own image in a matter of weeks. Advisors who shared her vision of a contemporary, morally upright monarchy started to emerge as trusted friends in important roles. Catherine moved the foundation's vitality towards initiatives that spoke to the soul of a broken public, modern unity, and family welfare, whereas previously it had poured money into the preservation of art, patronage, and heritage. She described it as an agenda that strengthened her hold on power while echoing compassion. It was her message to the world and to Britain. This kingdom would no longer conceal itself behind opulence. It would follow her silent order and lead via empathy. William, ever the cautious diplomat, stood at her side in public, his words calm and his support unwavering. However, the gap between them widened behind closed doors. He noticed the subtle undercurrent of consolidation in every change she started, and he admired her brilliance, possibly even feared it. His opinion was valued but not decisive, and his position as heir started to feel decorative. Catherine never tried to directly overshadow him. She just executed with perfection that left little opportunity for indecision, moved more quickly, and thought more deeply. He recognized her motivation. She was getting ready for a time when mistakes would no longer be concealed and legacies may be destroyed in an instant. In private, though, he questioned how much of the soul of the crown was being exchanged for survival. Whispers multiplied in the royal corridors. Senior employees, many of whom had worked under monarchs for generations, expressed a mixture of wonder and discomfort while discussing her leadership. One regarded her as methodical. Another said, fearless, but the word that was most frequently used in both admiring and terrifying tones was surgical. Catherine saw reform as a methodical process rather than an act of insurrection. She removed what was no longer useful, made cuts where deterioration had taken hold, and put something useful in its place. Her efficiency was characterized by conviction rather than emotion. She refused to be remembered by history as the woman who hesitated because she thought the monarchy may either change or disappear. But there was a cost to her assent. Once the king's closest confidant in affairs of state, Camilla began to feel more and more alone. Her impact, which had been constant but subtle, started to fade. The invitations ceased to come in. She used to be involved in briefings, but now Catherine and the king handled them personally. According to people close to the queen consort, she was becoming increasingly frustrated and even afraid that the younger lady she had before undervalued was now subtly destroying everything she and Charles had created together. Camilla's allies described tense dinners and restless nights in private, where the king's silence was more powerful than any disagreement. Documents with Catherine's signature started to circulate in the meantime. It was covert at first. Internal permissions show her initials next to Charles's. Then, in topics pertaining to the foundation, her name progressively took his position. There was no announcement made to the public, but there was no denying the change. Her authority was now evident in every document, authorization, and act of governance within the foundation. She had taken over one of the most potent tools of the monarchy without any formalities, and she had done it so skillfully that not even Parliament dared to protest the shift. Her impact extended beyond the foundation and permeated the larger agenda of the monarchy. Her tone started to reverberate through public projects, resilience, compassion, unity, and dignity. Under her guidance, the royal family's once distant atmosphere gave way to a planned warmth, but beneath the kind exterior, Catherine's concentration became more acute. Despite all of her reforms and good intentions, she was aware that real control required an awareness of the secrets, institutions, and shadows that had controlled royal power for generations. Silently, she started delving farther into the inner workings of the foundation. Everything would be altered by what she discovered there. She discovered something far deeper than incompetence or poor management, buried deep behind archives, behind coded ledgers and forgotten records. A path that touched names deemed untouchable, across continents, and went back decades. Truth itself would put her to the test today, not policy. However, policy wasn't the real turning point. The next thing Catherine discovered was a secret financial trail that may reveal decades of royal secrets, sealed away from prying eyes and political criticism. The vault beneath Buckingham Palace is thought to hold the monarchy's oldest financial records. Few people have ever been inside this secret repository. Catherine had a straightforward goal in mind when she ordered a thorough audit of the Crown Foundation. It must guarantee openness in order to give an old institution contemporary trust. However, the auditors found much more than just administrative oversight. They came and found entries in coded ledgers written in symbols and acronyms that had not been used in decades. A trail connecting the foundation's funds to covert offshore accounts started to appear within them. Catherine realized the seriousness of what she held as soon as she was briefed. Money wasn't the only issue here. It was about power and the secrets that had kept it safe for many years. Unaccounted donations, dating back more than 40 years, were found in the ledgers. Some were connected to obscure multinational trusts with no discernible purpose, while others were listed under anonymous initials. It grew darker the further the team delved. Auditors discovered links to shell corporations dispersed throughout former colonial lands within the documents, many of which appeared to be directed through middlemen with connections to initiatives outside of government control. To put it simply, the Crown's own financial arm seemed to have funded endeavors that blurred the boundaries between covert influence and royal diplomacy. It was the kind of revelation that might instantly shatter the moral basis of the monarchy. The mood became electrifying as Catherine challenged the board. Tradition-driven, the older trustees cautioned her against rehashing old wounds, reminding her that such shadows had always persisted throughout organizations spanning generations. They urged caution. However, Catherine was unwilling to remain silent. "Everything we stand for becomes a lie if we hide this," she replied icily. Once regarded as her best quality, her tenacity now started to frighten many around her. She was no longer only bringing the monarchy up to date. She was tearing down its final barrier of secrecy. The opposition arrived quickly. Senior assistants cautioned that disclosing the contents of the vault might result in a criminal investigation, a diplomatic controversy, or even a constitutional reaction. The confidential secretary of the monarch begged for moderation. "Your intentions are noble," he said to her. However, Catherine's determination simply became stronger. "But this is not your battle to fight." She had seen and learnt too much. She could no longer serve a monarchy based on concealment since, to her, quiet equated to involvement. Transparency did not equate to revolt. In her opinion, it was atonement. She was aware that the expense would be disastrous, though William made one final attempt to stop her. He begged her to change her mind late one evening in a conversation that few would ever remember. "You can't expose this without burning everything," he said in a terrified, strained voice. "The crown doesn't survive full truth. It never has." But Catherine, unshaken, met his gaze. "Then let it burn," she responded. "If it must fall to rise again, so be it." Those statements signaled the beginning of an irreversible separation between them that was motivated by principles rather than rage. Catherine then made her decision. She directed that the audit's conclusions be kept intact, unaltered, and unsealed so that they could be made public when the time came. Her family recoiled, her aides complained, but she had made up her mind. This was more than just a governance issue for Catherine. Before her rule had really started, it was put to the test. More than corruption has been exposed by the vault under Buckingham Palace. It had exposed the kind of reality that could never be concealed. In order to expose the truth, regardless of who it destroyed, Catherine made a decision that would permanently split the royal family. Windsor went silent the night before the renaming ceremony. Uncertainty reverberated through the passageways that had seen centuries of royal perseverance. As King Charles met with Camilla and his confidential secretary in the Stygia meeting that would later become the subject of rumors and anxiety, lights burned through the night. What was said inside those walls is unknown, but by daybreak, everything had altered. There was no longer a crown foundation. It was replaced by the royal trust under the Princess of Wales' patronage. And Charles's signature shuddered at the bottom of the edict, appearing to be scribbled in surrender rather than power. Conflicting stories would subsequently surface, with some claiming the king signed the document voluntarily and others insisting he did so under intolerable pressure. The hours building up to that moment were chaotic behind closed doors. What started out as a conversation about future stewardship swiftly turned hostile. Even the senior staff was allegedly astonished when Camilla, who had long been used to her subtle influence over royal decisions, clashed with Catherine. Through the door, witnesses heard fragments, terms like betrayal, legacy, and control. It was more than a foundation dispute. It was a struggle over who would define the essence of the monarchy. Catherine remained steadfast, her arguments full of crushing accuracy and cool reasoning. "This isn't about taking power," she stated in an unwavering tone. "But Camilla," she said, raising her voice, accusing her of undermining Charles and destroying the same institution she purported to defend. "It's about saving what's left. You're rewriting his reign while he's still living it," she allegedly yelled. The monarch found it difficult to remain composed as he was torn between two powerful forces. Neither woman gave in to his confidential secretary's pleas for moderation. The confrontation exposed the unvarnished reality. The monarchy was now a Greek house split between tradition and change, rather than a single, cohesive entity. Tension turned into sorrow as the night went on. Midway through the conversation, William left Windsor, caught between love and loyalty. He would not take sides. He saw what was coming. According to those close to him, this is a permanent change in royal power, not a negotiation. Charles was left alone after his departure, caught between the pressure of Catherine's sentence and the weight of his crown. The king's determination had weakened by the time he was shown the final paper. Later, his advisors described him as pale, preoccupied, and as if he had just been informed of the inevitable. He signed out of fear, exhaustion, or reluctant acceptance, and that one act changed the course of history. The announcement was made at first light. In a carefully crafted statement, the palace described the reform as a uniting step towards modernization and transparency. Calm, practiced, and almost antiseptic was the tone. However, beneath the polished language was an empire that had been rocked to its foundation. 3 of Charles's longest-serving aides quit without cause within a day. Their modest but meaningful departures marked the end of a period that had shaped the king's rule. Senior courtiers called that night the breaking in secret. Not only is tradition being broken, but trust, loyalty, and the unseen ties that formerly bound the royal circle together are also being broken. Nevertheless, Catherine maintained her composure throughout the storm. She didn't rejoice or back down, although she appeared composed and purposeful in public. Anyone close to her could sense the magnitude of what she had initiated. For years to come, the monarchy would be plagued by the cost of her victory. The queen consort stopped attending public events, and her silence became a form of protest in and of itself. Charles withdrew behind procedure, his formerly assured speeches now constrained, circumspect, and practically scripted. Whispers deepened inside the palace. There were many who said the king had been forced. Others thought he had given involuntarily because they saw Catherine as the only person who could keep the monarchy relevant. In any case, the hierarchy had changed by dawn. Catherine was the current power leading the crown, not only the future. The ink had not yet dried, and the monarchy had been rewritten overnight. However, Catherine's audacious deed had awakened powers well beyond the royal walls. So she was incorrect if she believed the storm would pass quietly. One fundamental precept had been upheld by Parliament for centuries: never meddled with the domestic affairs of the throne. However, that silence broke this time. More than only rumors had been sparked by the Crown Foundation's new name. It had caused fury. In a matter of days, committees met, investigations were started, and the term overreach rang out like a warning throughout Westminster's hallways. Legislators questioned whether Catherine, as Princess of Wales, had breached a boundary established by centuries of royal restraint and wanted explanations for what they called a constitutional issue. The public saw it as a reform narrative. Politicians perceived it as an unwritten handover of power, a covert change taking place right in front of the country. The argument became heated. Veteran lawmakers demanded to know why royal funds were being reorganized without consulting Parliament while they stood in the House. Anonymous leaks started making the rounds in political circles, implying that the rebranding had nothing to do with charity. It has to do with succession. In briefing notes, the term succession acceleration was used, suggesting that the monarchy was experiencing a cautious transfer of power behind palace gates. Previously defined as ceremonial, Catherine's impact was now described as operational. Every step she took, including approving new trustees, supervising funds, and participating directly in public pronouncements, was scrutinized as proof of a covert revolution. Never had the shroud of secrecy around the monarchy felt so thin. However, Catherine resisted giving in to political pressure. She faced the impending maelstrom with composed defiance, coming forward as a reformer rather than a defendant. She discussed accountability as a means of regeneration in a rare speech, which struck a strong chord with younger audiences. She said that the monarchy must represent the ideals of the people it serves if it is to endure another century. For her fans, it was a clear indication that she was guiding the monarchy into a new era of openness and direction. However, her detractors saw it as conceit, overstepping the bounds of tradition. A princess presents herself as the crown's moral compass. Overnight, public opinion broke. She was praised by modernists and young Britons as the monarchy's long-needed reformer. Social media campaigns praising her leadership and referring to her as the people's contemporary monarch thrived under However, anger simmered among loyalists and traditionalists. They witnessed betrayal and the gradual breakdown of holy order. Newspapers that supported the old power circles charged her with taking advantage of Charles's quiet to gain power and manipulating a weakened monarch. Uncertain if her audacity was courage or recklessness, even some court insiders started to falter. And Charles said nothing at all. The mystery was only heightened by his absence from the discussion. No comments, no public appearances, and no indication of involvement for weeks. Speculation flourished in the emptiness of his silence. Was this a slow-motion abdication or a tactical retreat? There were rumors that the king had gone into quiet contemplation due to health issues, and there were also rumors that Catherine was already presiding over sessions that were previously held by the monarch. Every rumor strengthened the impression that Britain was just awaiting confirmation that the previous balance of power had already shifted. The effects extended beyond the United Kingdom. Foreign commentators started to discuss a change in soft power, pointing out that political personalities and foreign organizations were contacting Catherine directly more and more, eschewing the king's office completely. Her impact was not limited to speeches. She was also a contemporary queen with calm authority who commanded attention from all around the world through symbolism. She was seen by some as the monarchy's savior. Others see it as a silent usurper. Nevertheless, Catherine remained unfazed by the intensifying political scrutiny and media frenzy. Each assault only strengthened her will. She realized the crown was more than a family. It was a survival-based institution, and survival required evolution, even if that evolution took the form of rebellion. Even so, she was aware that her biggest obstacle had not yet materialized as she navigated the turmoil of conflicting allegiances and withstood the wrath of Parliament. This was because the next voice to oppose her would come from within the royal line itself, not from the press or Parliament. However, one unexpected voice, not from Parliament, but from the heart of the royal family itself, emerged as the political temperature rose. William had remained silent for months. His shield had been silence, a flimsy attempt to defend the wife he no longer understood and the father he loved. The palace was tense, the country waited, and the media conjectured, but the truth can only be suppressed so long by silence. William's stoic composure broke when the trustees of the crown publicly supported Catherine and expressed their complete faith in her vision for the future of the monarchy. He was aware that he could no longer live as a ghost in two different realms. Thus, he eventually talked in a rare and measured televised interview, as a man caught in the crossfire of history rather than as an heir or husband. Even though his remarks were straightforward and even boring, they had the power of an empire. He paused before continuing, acknowledging that the name was unavoidable. It was a part of a longer shift that we all anticipated. For the first time, the public heard what insiders had whispered for months, that Catherine's ascendancy was no but design, a process secretly backed by the monarch himself. When prodded by the interviewer, William chose his words with sad care. "My father understood what was coming," he said, and he chose dignity over resistance. It was a confession that sounded like both admiration and sadness. Charles, the king, still wearing the crown, had gladly stood aside in spirit, and his son had just verified it to the world. The reaction was instantaneous and electric. People in Britain were split between shock and pity. William's candor was commended by some, who described it as a moment of royal transparency. He was accused by some of giving up and letting tradition be changed without resistance. However, there was something much more human behind that public uproar. The world saw fatigue in his eyes, the silent breaking point of a man caught between loyalty and duty. He cherished his dad. He cherished his spouse. However, they both stood for divergent ideas about the future of the monarchy. One was founded on change, while the other was constrained by history. He had remained silent out of loyalty. He was speaking about survival now. Some people couldn't read Catherine's expression as she watched the interview from Windsor. She was graceful in her silence. Others saw it as a calculation. She only had one response when questioned about William's comments, which sent shivers down the spine of the press corps. "A family is not divided by truth. Secrets do." That emotionless statement served as both a warning and a defense. Her objective had never been personal. It was revealed to the world. It had been unavoidable. Even her detractors started to realize how deeply she believed at that very time. She wasn't battling for power. In a century where crowns were no longer cherished, she was trying to preserve the monarchy. Headlines around the world went crazy. The Queen of Shadows. They gave her a title that evoked both wonder and terror. She was the reformer that Britain needed, according to her followers. The woman revitalises an aging dynasty. She was the strategist who had outwitted both the monarch and the heir, according to her critics. In any case, Catherine's tale was set in stone. She was no longer seen as a royal consort by the world. They perceived her as the force behind the throne, or even the one who would take it in the near future. The mood within the palace was unsettlingly serene. "It's the quiet before something happens," according to staff. The once noisy hallways were now simply filled with the faint sound of protocol going on as if nothing had changed. However, everyone was aware that everything had. Charles retreated even further into private activities. William, who was still the link between them, found himself standing on territory that no longer belonged to either side as Camilla's presence waned. In the midst of that silence, Catherine started planning her next move. One that would make all earlier storms because she was already preparing her most daring act to date, while the monarchy adapted to its new reality. But with the monarchy, peace seldom lasts. And Catherine's next move to make the Crown Foundation's archives public would spark the worst upheaval since the abdication crisis. Catherine altered not only the name but also the essence of monarchy with a single decree. The air in Britain changed the day she revealed the full documents of the Crown Foundation. The mysteries of royal finance, patronage, and power were revealed for the first time in centuries. The decades-long archives revealed a maze of mismanagement and deceit, but they also showed the silent, unrecognized deeds of service that had sustained the organization. In a single act of revelation, Catherine reconfigured the monarchy's power by tearing down the barriers that had protected it from criticism. Truth now safeguarded what had previously been shielded by silence. The new crown's armor was accountability. The response was swift and widespread. Even the toughest detractors could not dispute the move's genius, despite some calling it foolish and others daring. In order to demonstrate integrity without inciting insurrection, Catherine had pushed back the veil just enough. The monarchy appeared vulnerable while retaining its fundamental power because of transparency by design rather than destruction. Her tactic captured the attention of the media, who dubbed it the Catherine Doctrine, a worldview based on the dichotomy of control and openness reveals. Just enough to rebuild confidence but never enough to erode mystique. She transcended her role as a figurehead overnight. She developed into a reformer, a powerful philosopher, and a mastermind behind the revival of monarchy. Global leaders took notice, both within and outside the Commonwealth. The British monarchy was hailed as an example of adaptation by foreign dignitaries, who had previously considered it a ceremonial relic. No royal before her dared to accomplish what she did. According to one politician, she has restored humanity to the crown, making it unbeatable. With the flood of praise from throughout the world, Catherine became a global icon of honesty and advancement. Those closest to the palace, however, had a different perspective. The accuracy of a strategist who had realized that survival required sacrifice, rather than the soft glow of reform. She had accomplished what her forebears had failed to do. She had given the impression that power was clean, but there was no denying the price of this victory inside the palace. Weary and reflective, Charles declared that he would be stepping back from most public responsibilities in order to devote more time to introspection. Although he made a respectful and calm statement, others who looked between the lines saw it as a subtle spiritual abdication. There was no dethronement of the king. All he had done was move aside to create space for something bigger than himself. Aides talked of his increasing serenity and even pride in private. Catherine had not vanquished him. In a sense, he had picked her. Her rule had been about evolution, whereas his had been about preservation. Meanwhile, Camilla disappeared from the public eye. Her once prominent presence disappeared into rumors of private times spent overseas and healing retreats. Although her departure was not made public or explained, it signaled the end of an era and the old guard. Those who had previously worked behind the scenes to shape the monarchy were now on the outside of a building that Catherine had erected in her likeness. Once split by factions, the royal household was now centered around her. Therefore, Catherine became the de facto ruler of a contemporary kingdom without being crowned or proclaimed. There was simply a silent understanding among those who worked for her, no crown on her head, and no oath on her lips. The monarchy had not just endured, reform, openness, and subdued dominance had brought it back to life. She had transformed secrecy into strategy and weakness into strength. What started off as a name change turned into a quiet revolution, a throne that is claimed by intelligence rather than heredity. Both appreciation and discomfort coexisted in equal measure as Britain adapted to its new system. While some saw regime transition, others saw rejuvenation. She was praised by the populace for shattering centuries of opacity. Many, however, were curious about what she may construct in its stead. Catherine herself did not respond, speaking infrequently and carefully selecting her words. She appeared to think that power was most effective when it remained silent. And one question hung over Britain as the palace gates closed every night. Was this a change in regime or a renewal? Unspoken but inexorable, Catherine's rule begins in that eerie ambiguity.